The morning clouds hung heavy in the mountain ridges as Hubert Watkins stepped outside his cabin to wash his face in the damp white mist. That's right, that's how high up he lived. His pa's little log house was built on the steep side of old Thunderhead Mountain, so far up that the valley down below looked misty blue like an opal. The houses down there in the settlement seemed tinier than matchboxes. Yet, it was easy to pick out the old one-room schoolhouse from the others, for its new tin roof glittered in the sun and sent up shafts of light like a shining diamond. Hubert sat on a rock ledge in front of the old homestead and stared down at the bright roof longingly. You see, he was already 10 years old, but he had never been to school a day in his life. If you traveled by the winding, twisting road, it was a mighty far piece to the school down in the valley. Heck, it took a whole day just to get there, but Hubert knew a shortcut. Though it was a steep and toilsome way, zigzagging down the face of the mountain, Hubert could make it in an hour. But when he pleaded with his mother to let him go down and get some learning, she always said, "I'm afeared for you to walk it alone in the wintertime." If the snow began to fly, pretty soon the trail would be covered as smooth and as white as a fresh-made feather bed, and you wouldn't know which way to turn. She was scared Hubert would go wandering on the mountains until he was lost and frozen in the cold. "No, sir, young man. You'll have to make out for a while longer with what your pappy and I can teach you," his ma would always say. But Hubert didn't forget about the school. All the boys down in the valley went there. They learned how to read stories out of books, tales of cowboys and hunts, and other things that seemed exciting. And they played games down there in the valley too, Fox in the War and baseball, and at the end of the year, they practiced public speaking, where each pupil would go up and say a little piece, all dressed in his Sunday best. Yes, sir, it was something Hubert could only dream about. "Can't I just start this year, Ma, and go until the days begin to get cold?" the young boy pleaded. "Well, I suppose there'd be no harm in that," his ma figured. "You can go during the month of September. There's never any snow in that time of year." Just like that, Hubert was full of joy. After all, even 1 month in school was something to look forward to. But Hubert soon began to worry about his clothes. All he had to wear was a pair of blue overalls and a homespun shirt. The other boys in the school would have on new shirts, store-bought pants, and nice striped shirts. And then there were books. Where would he get the money for books? There was always plenty to eat in the little cabin on Thunderhead, because Pa raised everything they needed. There were warm clothes, too, because Ma spun the wool from their own sheep and wove it into cloth. But there was never any money to spare. But Hubert was itching for some clothes like the other boys had, and some books so that he could study his lessons. If there were only a way he could earn a little money, he thought to himself. The next day, he said to his ma, "I think I'll go ask Mr. Honeycutt if he would like some help picking his apples and loading them into the wagon to take to town. Maybe I could make me a little money to buy some store clothes and some books." So the mountain boy set over the ridge to his neighbor's farm in the next cove. "Why, yes, I could use a little help loading my apples," Mr. Honeycutt said as he twisted his handlebar mustache. Hubert set out to work, picking up the sound apples from the ground, plucking the ripe ones from the tree, sacking them, and helping Mr. Honeycutt to hoist them into his covered wagon. When it was loaded good and high, Mr. Honeycutt hitched his old brown mule between the shafts. Then he climbed into the driver's seat. "Don't you worry, son. I won't forget you when I sell my apples down in town," he promised, as he cracked his whip and went creaking down the rough mountain road. "I'll be back in 2 or 3 days, and I'll stop by your house with your pay." During the time Mr. Honeycutt was away, Hubert wondered if he would get a good price for his apples. He hoped so, 'cause if he did, he might pay Hubert enough to buy all the things the young boy wanted. "If he pays me only enough to get part of them," he thought, "I'll buy me the store-bought pants first. A homespun shirt wouldn't look so outlandish if he had a pair of proper pants to go with it. After that, he would buy a reader." On the 3rd day, when he heard the rumble of Mr. Honeycutt's wagon wheels coming around a mountain. He ran to the cabin door. "Whoa!" cried Mr. Honeycutt, pulling up in front of the door. "Well, Hubert, I've got your pay." He was smiling so that his mustache spread all over his face. He must have got a good price, and he's going to pay me a lot, thought Hubert, taking note of his good humor. He ran out to the covered wagon and looked up expectantly. Mr. Honeycutt leaned into the back of the wagon behind the white canvas top and began to pull something forward. "Well, here's your pay. How do you like it?" Around the edge of the wagon top peered a neat, fur-covered head with 2 dainty horns. A goat. A tripped little brown beard wiggled merrily as his jaws worked. The goat was chewing busily on the end of something white. It was Mr. Honeycutt's shirt tail. "Here! How did you get a hold of that?" The old man laughed, pulling it away from his passenger and stuffing the ragged edge back into the top of his trousers. "Well, how do you like him?" he asked, turning back to Hubert. "He cost a little more than I ought to pay for having my apples picked, but then I remembered how a boy loves a goat." Hubert was surprised, but it wouldn't do to let Mr. Honeycutt see that he was disappointed to get a goat instead of money. Besides, it was a pretty neat-looking little goat, and he had always wanted one. "Gee, Mr. Honeycutt, he sure is a fine goat." "I thank you, I sure do." He took the goat's rope, and the trim little animal bounded gracefully out of the wagon. "Land sakes, what have you got there?" Hubert's ma asked as the goat stepped into the cabin with the boy. "Well, I've got me a goat, though it's not what I expected. It's my pay for picking Mr. Honeycutt's apples. But I thought you wanted some money to get yourself some clothes to wear to school." "Well, anyways, it's what he brought me," Hubert replied. "And I'd as soon have him, I reckon." The goat quickly made himself right at home. Hubert fixed him a nice bed of leaves in a corner of the woodshed, and he fed him some corn or oats every day and let him crop the grass in front of the cabin. The goat was never too busy eating to stop for a tussle with Hubert, for he was frisky and full of fun. He would rear up on his hind legs and butt at Hubert playfully, and sometimes, when Hubert bent over to pick something up, he ran at him from behind and sent him tumbling. One time he did it when Hubert was pouring a bucket full of buttermilk for the pigs. Over Hubert went, sprawling into the trough full of buttermilk. He went swishing and squashing to the house, and with streams of buttermilk running from his clothes, from his hair, and even out of his ears. When his ma saw it, she said, "That's it. That goat's getting to be a nuisance. You best take him down to town and sell him. Then you'd have the money to buy your things." Hubert shook his head. Naughty as the goat was, he had learned to love him. He didn't like to think of selling him, even for some new clothes in his books. There must be another way of making a little money. One day, he had a bright idea. "I think I'll go along to Mr. Posey's place and see if he needs some help with his molasses." And off he went. Yet, he was hardly out of his own yard when he heard a scampering of small feet, and the goat ran alongside. When the pair arrived, Mr. Posey scratched his beard. "I might need some help, but it's a lot of work, making molasses, cutting the sugar cane in the fields, driving the mule around and around to squeeze the juice in the homemade mill, then standing over the juice and boiling until it gets thick and sweet and heavy. I've already made one big barrel full. It was a sight of trouble, but if I do say so, it's pretty good molasses. Would you like a taste?" Then the old man leaned over and dipped a large spoon in the barrel. As soon as the goat saw the old man bend over, he couldn't resist. He stood off a little way, then came at Mr. Posey with a rush and sent him sprawling head first into the barrel of molasses, covering the old man in the thick tar like black molasses. "Boy, you and that goat get out of here now," the old man shouted. The next day, Hubert went about his chores as he tried to think of another way to earn some money. "I think I'll go pick some berries. Maybe I can pick enough to sell in town and buy my school stuff." Before he set out, he took a stout piece of rope and tied the goat to a tree. "That'll fix you, troublemaker. Now you stay here." So off the young boy went, with a big basket over his arm. He was only halfway to the peak where the biggest blackberries grew when he heard a noise behind him. He turned and looked and there was that darn goat, happily walking up the stony trail, dragging the remains of the chewed-up rope. Nonetheless, Hubert carried on with his plan. All day long he picked berries on the high mountainside, and the goat was just as good as he could be. Once his basket was full, the pair set off for home. I'll get a mighty fine price for these. I can't wait to show Ma. Once he got home, he sat the bucket on the porch and went inside to fetch his Ma. Yet when he came back outside, the entire bucket was turned over in the dirt. The goat had scuffed and crushed them all, and his mouth was stained with blackberry juice. "I done told you to get rid of that darn goat," his Ma said as she turned around and walked back in the house. And so it was. Finally, the first day of September came, and young Hubert shut the goat up in the wood shed and set off for school wearing the same worn-out homemade overalls and shirt. A little while later, Ma went out to the shed and opened the door, and before she knew it, the goat ran like a flash of lightning, and down the mountain trail he went. There was the schoolhouse just up the road, and Hubert's heart raced. This was the moment he had craved for so long, but he was too embarrassed. He could see the kids playing in the distance. They all had new clothes on. He dropped his head and stopped in his tracks. "They will never accept me," he thought to himself, as he slowly turned around and decided to go back home. No sooner than Hubert turned to leave, someone shouted, "Look, a new boy, and he has a goat." Within moments, Hubert was surrounded by nearly a dozen kids, who were asking so many questions about the goat that they hadn't even noticed Hubert's faded shirt and old blue overalls, and the goat. Well, he just pranced with delight at seeing so many kids. He stood up on his hind legs and butted the boys and chased all the girls. All the kids were laughing, and a smile spread across Hubert's face. Just like that, he had made a passel of new friends. Heck, the teacher even gave him an armful of free books.